Good evening, everyone. I'm Kari Reagan, the moderator of NATS Chats, which are sponsored by Inside View Press. Thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation about cannabis and singers. And I'm joined by Erin Ziegler and Jiries Meham-Atrash. Thank you guys for being with me tonight.
Thanks for having us, Kari.
Yes, thank you.
Erin, let's start with you. What I would love to start with is just a little bit about your background, that you're a speech language pathologist. Share a little bit about that, and then a brief beyond the bio.
Oh, okay. Beyond the bio.
Things that we wouldn't see in
How
your
beyond are we going? All
tonight.
right.
No holds barred.
How beyond did you go last night?
No. To sleep.
Sometimes that's why people use consume cannabis, edibles, for instance. Pain, sleeping. Yeah. So, but getting back to your question. Hey, I had to get it in. I had
He
to
told
get
me
it
the
in.
story too.
Hey, it was great advertising, for sure.
That was my intent. And a little humor.
All right. I thought it was also a little bit to say, I wonder what it feels like, what somebody would be experiencing. I don't know. Was that any?
I have past experiences.
Got it. Wasn't the inaugural edible.
Oh, no.
Got it. Well, then this will be maybe an easier conversation. All right. So I'm Dr. Erin Ziegler. I'm currently the co-owner of the Wellness Group for Voice, Speech, and Swallowing in Portland, Oregon. It's a speech language pathology practice, but both my partner and I are singing voice specialists. So we help a lot of singers who are national singers or local singers, or even avocational singers who participate in choirs, whether it be for a religious reason or for just community choirs. And before going into speech pathology, I was a performer, a singer, and an actor. Have a BFA from University of Michigan in theater. And really, I think most importantly to your audience, in addition to being a speech pathologist, is that I had the privilege, and maybe George is on here tonight, I don't know, George Shirley, but certainly George Shirley was a huge influence in my singing abilities and my performance career, but also as a speech pathologist. And really, this whole reason that we're here tonight, I owe to George Shirley, because when I was living in Hong Kong, so a little bit beyond the bio, how about beyond the US, and very, my thoughts are with everybody as we deal with this new virus. But when I was living in Hong Kong for 2 years, I reached out to George Shirley and Annette Masson. She's no longer with us, but I reached out to them. She was my acting voice coach at University of Michigan, and said, I want to work with voices. How do I do that? There was a little boy in my class, about 10 years old, a singing class that I had started in Hong Kong at this performing arts class, and he had a hoarse voice. So I reached out to George, and George said, "What have you ever considered working with the disordered voice, the speech, in becoming a speech pathologist?" So George, not only as a singing instructor, but then really guiding me towards the anatomy, physiology, science of what I later became was a speech pathologist. And so went on for a PhD, work with aging voice, work with, as I said, the performing voice, also work on prevention, and really interested in thinking about prevention and how to really make that work, because voice disorders are preventable. And so we just have to find a better way. There are too many people coming to see me, to be honest. So that's a little bit about me. Beyond the bio, even more, I love to travel. I think last time I counted, I had the good fortune of being able to visit and experience cultures from 23 different countries. I'll be going back to Ghana in a couple of weeks to teach voice disorders there.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I'll be working with the master students. There's the second cohort. I was there in 2018 for the first cohort. And what was really funny is that I went to visit, and very germane to today's talk, I went to this part of Ghana called Jamestown in Accra, the capital. And Jamestown is a very, it was the first settlement for the British in Accra when they came and um, were overtaking the locals' land. And it's on the beach there is a community. And I was walking around and got a tour and sat and talked. And there's a singer there, an Afro beat singer, I think Afro pop. And as I'm talking to him and learning about his troubles, he's smoking a joint. But I didn't say anything about that because he was talking about his vocal demands and his vocal load. And while I knew the joint was probably not the best for his singing, it was cultural. I just met the person. He was opening up to me. He wanted to hear my advice on something else. He didn't ask me about what do you think about this cannabis use. And he wouldn't have stopped. So what was the better advice? Talking about reducing vocal load when you can, right? Because he'll actually do that. And I respect his culture. Cannabis has been around for a long time, as Jiries can talk about. Yeah, cannabis has been around for thousands of years, originating, I think, in Africa, if I recall correctly. But
And in Asia, like the Asian steppes, like Kazakhstan, Russia,
okay,
India,
yeah.
around there. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Jiries, why don't you give us a little introduction? Because you're not, well, I shouldn't assume that you're not a singer. Are you a
I'm not,
singer?
no. No, I do enjoy karaoke a lot though.
So you are a singer, and so
I'm a singer.
you have to think about your voice if you're going to do that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I actually have a scratchy throat a little bit, sorry. So,
Just
but
get a forward resonance. No, I'm just playing.
yeah, yeah.
I'll work with you later.
Okay.
What is your background, Jiries? Tell us about your
So
background.
my background is in chemistry mainly. So I got a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry in New York, and I knew some people. Cannabis background on cannabis. Cannabis is on university campuses a lot, obviously, but I knew some people that worked at High Times magazine, and that's I don't know if you two or the audience is familiar with the magazine. It's been around for almost about 43 years, maybe, and it's the only magazine that's been the subject matter entirely of cannabis and other illegal drugs to some extent. And it's really great, just a objective looking at that. Obviously, there's a lot of fun with it. And anyway, so I got pulled in as an internship there, and it was really interesting. And I started writing a lot. And since I had a science degree, I fell in, and they actually made me the science editor of the magazine for a couple of years, and wasn't something I wanted to continue. I didn't want to continue as a writer. I want to get back in the lab. I'm hearing about all this great science. I wanted to start getting there and doing some of that. And so I went to graduate school in Portland State. So all this is in New York City. I went to graduate school in Portland State University, and I really picked PSU because there's this really great sort of trio of investigators looking into e-cigarettes and other tobacco products, and really interesting science of the way we've been tackling some of these questions. And really, I knew that they were one of the good guys when they were being trash talked so much by the cigarette nicotine industry. So it was a really great sort of environment. And I came in there with my background in cannabis, and I wanted to work on that. And I said, hey, there's this. These are new products. This is a new thing. So we needs to look at it. No one's looking at it at all. At this cannabis e-cigarette specifically.
Okay.
And so I started doing a lot of work in the field, in basically starting from ground zero, starting from the basics of looking at how do some of the things that people put into vaporizers, how does that interact with the body? Well, not so much the body, I guess, but studying what does that turn into? What happens to these things chemically when we vaporize them or combust them, and is it producing any sort of toxins? Is it producing less than smoking? You know, what is that? And it really identifying kind of what is it that people are inhaling, because, you know, they're surging in popularity even more than when I started. And so I'm in my 4th year now of a PhD program.
Okay.
And I've published a few pieces of research about cannabis vaping, specifically one of the first in that field of that specific topic. And you know, when I first started, there was an undergraduate in our lab, and she was really bright. She's one of the best undergrads that I've met. I think Dr. Ziegler, I don't know who I'm talking about. And she was the only undergrads that actually had a. I'm not sure if I'm hearing you, unless you're.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. She was the only undergrad that actually had a key, like a grad student. You know, I have a key to the lab. You know, I work there 24/7, right? And so she said, "Oh, you know a lot about this cannabis research, just coming into it from my background at High Times." And she introduced me to Dr. Ziegler, and we started. Dr. Ziegler said, "Hey, we want to write this review article, a literature review about cannabis in the voice." And since there's not a lot of research about cannabis in the voice, you know, we have to start from how does cannabis impact the respiratory tract. And so we did this. All 3 of us worked on this really great paper that's now in JAMA Otolaryngology. And yeah, so it's, you know, it's been that specifically learning about all that having to do with the respiratory tract has really made my research a lot richer too. And so I'd like to, you know, I've given some talks to different people, different backgrounds. And so it's really been great to sort of do a lot of translation from the chemistry side into how it impacts people that are going to be inhaling it. So this is a really great opportunity to be here and share some of this knowledge that we've together.
Well, let's dive in with, I'm sure there will be lots of questions that come up, but let's back up a wee bit. And Erin and I have already discussed this. We are not going to spend a bunch of time on smoking and cannabis. I think we've all been versed in that since the 70s or whenever. But what is, just briefly, Erin, the one thing that was interesting to me when I heard it years ago is that smoking pot actually holds a higher temperature than a cigarette. Is that a fact that you're aware of?
I'll leave that to Jiries, the actual specific temperature. What I do know is that inhalation, combustible methods of inhaling, so a joint, a pipe, where you're burning the flower or yeah, and so you're combusting the flower into creating, it happens at a higher temperature than vaporizing. Jiries, what about tobacco versus cannabis?
Well, tobacco versus cannabis is a big question. It's really apples and oranges. Obviously, tobacco is, after radon exposure, is the second leading cause of lung cancer, and so tobacco has, you know, if you ever see a tobacco leaf dry or not, it's thick, oily. It has all these triterpenes in them, which are just these thick, oily molecules that are just fats, and they burn down. They make all sorts of toxic molecules, and you know, there's thousands of other things in there that are toxic. But it's just going to make a lot of these carcinogens when combusted, due to not only just the temperature, but just the components that are inside of there. And it's smoking cannabis, it produces comparable amounts of certain degradants, but there's a lot of reasons why smoking cannabis doesn't seem, well, it's sort of a mystery, but it's like it should be causing more cancer cases than it's not, than it is, but it's not. It's, yeah, like I said, it's really apples and oranges. I mean, cigarettes are just, yeah.
So let's move into then. Well, before we talk about edibles, vaping, and topicals, and the edibles and vaping, of course, are what singers are wanting to know about. But let's set us up a little bit to discuss CBD and THC.
Right. So THC and CBD refer to the 2 main, I guess, molecules that are, you know, primarily located on the flower. But the flower is actually, there's many, many more constituents besides THC and CBD. There's things called terpenes. which I can have Jiries talk a little bit more about. But basically, CBD and THC refer to these two primary constituents of the cannabis flower from this plant, cannabis. THC is going to have more of a psychoactive effect. So it's going to be more mind altering. Whereas CBD doesn't have that mind altering psychoactive effect. And CBD is going to have more of a body and more localized effect, especially when used topically, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But so there's these two main molecules, but now, research, there isn't a lot of research in the US, and primarily that's because it's a controlled substance and classified, and it's very hard to access cannabis to do research. You have to go through many layers of government to secure a license to then be able to study cannabis and get samples of cannabis. So it's really hard in the US. There are studies in Israel, for example, has done a lot of research. And what we've learned is that it's much more complex than just CBD and THC. It's also much more complex than just indica or sativa, where sativa is generally more associated with a mind-altering high, whereas an indica plant is more, or indica strain is more associated with a body high, a more sedative effect. But that's not always the case, and it has to do a lot with also the terpenes as well.
Oops, we lost Erin.
Yeah, I just lost you there.
Erin, we've lost you. We'll let him get back on. Jiries, do you want to pick up while he's
Sure.
back on?
Yeah. Actually, one of the what you mentioned there about terpenes being psychoactive, that's actually something I would say is they've been finding out is not true. The cannabinoids, the THC, CBD, I think are going to be what mainly triggers the effects that you feel, and some other cannabinoids. So yeah, with THC and CBD, so THC affects the central nervous system, and that's where the receptors are for that. And then CBD affects receptors that are on the peripheral nervous system and other organs of the periphery. And some of the really interesting things that people are doing with research into like the gut, for example, or other medical effects is there's a lot going on there, obviously, that we won't get into, but THC and CBD have this interesting sort of interplay when if you're just talking about the psychoactive effect. And CBD will actually lessen some of these effects of THC that are more like inducing paranoia, for example, anxiolytic effects, they would call them. And so if you combine the two, it's a much more sort of medicinal effect. And that's to some degree where that indica sativa difference in subjective effects comes from, is they have different CBD levels in the indicas. But yeah, the indica sativa thing is also obviously like this whole big debate, even in the people that are like cannabis connoisseurs and the people that breed cannabis, that because these are all just strains. I mean, it's just like imagine two strains of apples. We imagine there was one big group of strains and another big group of strains. That's all this is, and they're just getting mixed together in here and there. And so yeah, it's really just one of the main differences is just how it smells. They definitely just smell different. If anyone's at a dispensary, they can find that out pretty easily. But yeah, I think a lot of the compounds that are in cannabis are more subjective, and the THC and CBD levels are the main drivers of what someone's going to experience.
And on this side of going to a dispensary and purchasing, which of course, Erin and I both live in states where it's legal. And, I know that you can buy CBD, which does not have the psychotropic, I don't know if I'm saying these things right, but impact, and you can buy it just for pain relief, or in fact, that's the main thing that I'm aware of it. You can buy it in just a pill form and take that. And then the edibles are really popular. So because you're avoiding the smoking at all, what would a singer be concerned about if they were doing an edible? What do we know about that if they're choosing that method?
So you know, let's be clear when we say what we know. Okay, so what we know is probably anecdotal or just based on what we know about physiology and what receptors it binds to and how it impacts the nervous system. So we don't know anything related to singers specifically, is what I want to make sure people understand. There's no randomized control trial with all singers to edibles and joints. Okay, we don't have that study. So we need those studies, and we did a study at with Dr. Gillespie from University of Pittsburgh and also here in Portland, where we looked at voice patients and their consumption of cannabis, and we found that 10% of our voice patients in Portland consumed cannabis. Not all of that was inhalatory. In fact, I remember one participant who actually came out. It's supposed to be an anonymous survey so that people can be more candid in responding. And she came out and she said, oh, I have to tell you something. I use this CBD oil on my skin because I have pain. Is that okay? And I'm like, yes. So just answer the question, whatever you feel. And so there's still taboo associated with it, right? She was using it to manage pain. She was probably, I think, in her 60s. And, you know, just coming out really kind of nervous to admit that she was using CBD, which has no psychoactive properties. So, you know, no psychoactive effects, I mean. It's more of a, as I'm sure Jiries explained. So edibles are going to be delayed. Anytime you have oral consumption, the effect is quite delayed. So, you know, anywhere from 45 minutes to, you know, 2 hours before you start to feel any noticeable effects. And of course, that's going to also depend on the concentration in the edible. And, you know, that's a big problem, you know, whereas when you go to your pharmacy and you get Tylenol, you know, every Tylenol has X milligrams of whatever the active ingredient is. Well, you know, while there is some ability to control, there's obviously not FDA oversight, I don't believe, of dispensaries, right, Jiries?
No, not
No.
at all.
And so the product can vary quite a lot.
It's
Hence,
definitely going to be better if you get in a dispensary than if it's a homemade gummy,
yeah,
like for example,
from
or
a friend.
just, yeah, yeah.
No, and
Dispensaries, you know,
singers might go out and then they're at a, you know, get together and somebody serves an edible brownie and they think what, you know, they have a, you know, large piece and they didn't expect it to be so concentrated or, you know, so.
yeah. And people can react much differently. I mean, yeah, I mean, some people, you know, you might think, oh, there's this really big guy, 5 milligrams and knocks him on the floor. And then I've met, you know, like 90-pound women that can eat 40 milligrams and nothing, you know, it's so, it can really vary a lot just person to person. And some of those effects are a little harder to track or predict. You just never, you really never know. That's why people use, you know, you titrate a dose. If you were to have access to a consistent product, then you know, you can take a little bit and see, you know, what works for you. And the THC CBD ratio, like if you do, it's like a 1-to-1, that's going to be a milder, what they say is a slightly milder effect, whereas other products at the same milligram dosage might make you react completely differently. And then it depends on what's in your stomach and lots of things, you know. So it can be, for a beginner, it can be risky business, but it's definitely something that people do successfully for whatever the purpose is, you know.
I have to say, I find at least here in Issaquah, the and I go in once a year, so let's be clear. Not that I have to have any shame about it if I went more, but I found them always to be, I'm of an age where it still seems odd that it's okay to talk about. But our people are so knowledgeable. I mean, it is a really beautiful facility. It's an elegant facility. And the people that work there are really helpful and knowledgeable in explaining everything. And it's comforting, I have to say. And they talk about the dosage and all that. And speaking of that, while I have the mic here, Arles Alford says she agrees about dosing of edibles being questionable and challenging, and she believes regulation to provide consistency in dosages is needed. Is that, not to go down this rabbit hole too far, but is that something you see coming?
Well, yeah, because there are, some negative effects if you, do have a reaction that's.
Goodness, we keep losing you, Erin.
That's weird.
We see you, but we can't hear you.
Yeah. Is there like, I wonder if it's his headphone jack? I don't know. But
Erin, we can't hear you again. Go ahead, Jiries.
so yeah, it's definitely something that the federal government is going to have to deal with soon, and it's something they're very likely already talking about, or if they already are, and I just am not familiar with it. But yeah, I mean, it is coming soon. It's the fastest growing industry. As of a couple of years ago, it was the fastest growing industry in the United States, and so there's a lot of investment, a lot of expansion. And you have big companies that are already coming in, existing big companies that are coming in. I mean, look at Canada. Canada saw this huge, huge surge, and obviously they legalized on the federal level, right? And so I don't know exactly how all the regulatory framework is working out, but it's going to happen in the United States. It's going to have to, because I mean, it's the pace that we're seeing in legalization. Every time there's a vote, there's a state that goes legal or that goes medicinal. The stats, God, we wrote it down here.
Like 33 states, right, for medicinal?
Yeah,
Or
it's nuts. Yeah, and the District of Columbia. That was an interesting little sort of juxtaposition to federal laws, and the fact that the District of Columbia is legal recreational when that happened. Yeah, regulation is coming, and it really needs it. It frankly just really needs it. And I don't want to already turn the topic to the EVALI outbreak, the e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury outbreak that we saw starting around September, and all these people dying from this lung injury from vaping. With that stuff going, with that kind of thing happening, there really needs to be regulation, because I mean, in this case, people died, not a heck of a lot if you compare it to other problems, but I mean, yeah, it's crazy. Obviously with e-cigarettes that's going on, e-cigarettes really rushed in fast, and way more people smoke e-cigarettes than are vaping cannabis. And the FDA really had to come in quick and made some changes, and it's a work in progress, but it's been interesting though. Yeah.
Sandy Hirsch says a lot of her clients, she's an SLP here in Seattle, say that the duration of high is more difficult to control with edibles, and it's a reason why many still choose to inhale versus eating. So it's a tough discussion. So, gosh, lots of questions are coming up in my mind, and I'm going to turn our corner really quickly with Sandy's comment. Let's assume that edibles, it's not for us to advise, but if somebody says they have a problem controlling and they choose to go to vaping, let's say, I don't know if that's what you're referring to, Sandy, when you say inhale, but can we assume that vaping is less harmful as far as any throat issues?
well, we have one study that really isolated cannabis as the inhaled source of irritant, was looking at respiratory health and function. It was a quasi-experimental study, meaning that they couldn't randomize. They didn't randomize in this study. Rather, they had people who were smoking cannabis. They then had them transition to vaping cannabis. and they studied how their respiratory symptoms and how the respiratory function changed when you switch from smoking to vaporizing. But you have an order effect there. So you know, you weren't able to test the other way when you go from vaping to smoking to know if the same results would have been taken place. But I think it's what we can take away is that there seems to be less respiratory irritation, so less mucus production, less cough, less throat clear when you switch from something combustible, so an inhaled method, to a vaporized method. And that
Awesome again. I have a comment about this really great study. Maybe we can find
do
it
a lot with the fact that one,
back.
the temperature is lower when you're vaporizing, and
Lost them again. Well, so one thing to point out about that study, very interesting, is that they were vaping cannabis flowers, and so they're using a product. They're using vaporizers that basically just heat the actual cannabis buds, ground down, and then those types of devices are completely different in how they function from the cartridge vaporizers, I guess you could call them. It's hard with the naming. There's all sorts of names people use, but basically they have cannabis extract in them, cannabis oil, and those are the types of vaporizers that are more, they mimic the functioning of like a nicotine e-cigarette. And they're the ones that were implicated in this EVALI outbreak, actually. And that's the kind of more the type of thing that I studied for a lot of reasons. But the actual flower vaporizers, as you could call them, one of the things you'd call them, I haven't studied them, and no one else has exactly studied their degradation. We do know that they produce less degradation as far as like the yield, but you know, it's impossible to say they're completely safe. But what we do know for sure is that they're going to be they're going to be just using lower temperature, and you know what temperature it's using. A lot of the more fancy devices will tell you can set the temperature, and it's actually pretty accurate. With a cartridge vaporizer that is going to be consuming oil, those things are going to be exposing to the oil to a pretty high level of temperature and a high energy level. I mean, this is an electrical device, so it's putting energy into that, and so those are definitely gonna. I've personally studied the degradation that comes out of that, and there's a lot of harmful things that are in there. You know, it's impossible to say what exactly that would do to you, but that is something that it was something people said that they don't produce any degradation. Well, they do to some degree. And another interesting thing is that when you compare the cartridge vaporizers to the flower vaporizers, the concentration of the THC in the aerosol, so like the cloud that you're going to inhale, in the flower vaporizers, the concentration of THC is much lower. And THC itself is kind of an acrid thing. It's actually toxic to the cell. Like the cannabis plant produces it as a defense of some sort, right? And so with the cartridge vaporizers, there's 90% THC in that thing. And so you're inhaling something that's 90% THC in the aerosol. So when you see a cloud coming out of one of those, that's all THC. And there's plenty of other medical effects that we read about, that we wrote about, that is a consequence from that. I mean, it's just completely changes what you're inhaling, you know. Dr. Ziegler, do you want to follow up on some of those things that we read out?
Yeah, so it sounds like you were talking about temperature being in effect, and then the degradation byproduct. And Jiries, you were mentioning your research that actually there are degradation byproducts even in vaporizing. And 300 is still higher than our body temperature, right? And so it's still pretty harmful because the body's responding to an irritant. And so it just makes the singer then more susceptible to injury. And then, you know, assuming that this irritation translates from that we see in the lungs translates to the larynx, you know, we would expect some edema. And so when we're talking about vocal mechanics biomechanics. We're talking about higher subglottal pressures now to vibrate the vocal folds with a little edema. Okay, maybe not so much a problem in your speaking voice when subglottal requirements are lower, but at a high E for a coloratura, that's going to be noticeable, right? So it really would also depend on when you're guiding a student or a singer, what type of genre they're trying to sing. Because I think that the main reason that I started getting interested in this topic was I was in Atlanta during my clinical fellowship and seeing rappers who were consuming cannabis mainly for stage fright, to feel more relaxed. And again, they weren't going to listen to me about quitting, but at least they would listen to me about maybe using a vaporizer, or maybe on the night that you rap, you have a performance, have an edible instead of smoking it, just so that things are a little bit better. Although one could say if your proprioception and everything is tied to your daily consumption of it, and that's how you consume it, maybe you don't want to change anything. Maybe as a singer, you've already become attuned to the edema, and so that's how I'm just saying, if that's because if you do go off cannabis if you stop smoking it or vaping it for a considerable amount of time, you will feel different sensations in your throat. Now, those are better, but they're going to be different. And you're going to have to recalibrate to that new subglottal pressure requirement, which may be lower, but it's like learning a slightly different instrument.
Absolutely.
So do we want to change somebody a week before their performance of a really important performance? I don't know. So it's a good question. I mean,
it is a good question. Let me get a couple questions in. Sandy wants to know, could you further define degradation? Are you talking about degradation? Are you talking about molecular degradation?
Yeah. We've studied how THC degrades, and so we took pure THC and we exposed it to conditions that were similar, that recreated vaporizing, and it degraded and it turned into other compounds, gases like isoprene or methacrylate or benzene, that are poisonous and would represent part of what you're going to inhale when you vaporize by certain methods. So we did dabbing and cartridge vaporizing. And so those types of toxic gases would be the type of thing that you might be exposed to when you're consuming these methods. So yeah, it's molecular degradation. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, so far we've already kind of sussed out that there are side effects for both. If you're doing edibles, there's the control concern that you would want to tell your clients about or your singers about, and of course what we've just been talking about with the vaping. So it's not it's not an easy answer, and they both come with considerations, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. And I think probably most importantly to singers, in addition to the health of the respiratory system, including the larynx, is that it can really affect the digestive system, and so can induce, cramping, can induce diarrhea. So you're talking about fluid loss. It does have some effects that can create dry mouth. So again, when your sensation is tied to when your sound is tied to the sensations in your mouth, your vocal tracts, your larynx, that change in sensation can, be a consideration. But really, the abdominal tract effects, I mean, the digestive tract effects, I think are the main concern, in addition to thinking about your perception. And so just your awareness, and depending on the strain, you'll have different effects to your perception. And so when you if you train when your perception is not affected by a consumption, but then you perform when it is, for instance, because you're anxious, maybe it improves it, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it actually gets in the way for some people. And so that could be, something to consider, that it obviously alters perception.
Have you found that cooling effects of a bong with or without ice are useful? That's from Jan Reed.
Well, I mean, I think that there probably is a cooling effect to, it probably cools it somewhat. I don't know anybody's done a study looking at the temperature as it enters your mouth versus as it enters your larynx. We do have a study by Mary Sandage that looked at just airflow and measured at different points in our vocal tract, and it did, the temperature changes. So what we know is that, that there probably might be a cooling effect, but you still have the degradation byproducts. You still have the THC that you're inhaling, or the CBD. So you're still inhaling the aerosol. It just would be cooler, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And when it actually comes to inhaling aerosols, this is something I learned recently. The temperature coming out, like the butt of a cigarette or a joint, or well, it's been studied for cigarettes. The temperature coming out of the butt of a cigarette, of the aerosol, it really rapidly equilibrates to the surrounding temperature. So as soon as it comes into your mouth, the smoke, it's pretty much at your body temperature. And so when they study the aerosol and some of the chemistry happening of the degradation products and how they behave, they assume the temperature is just body temperature, 40 Celsius. So it was the temperature of an inhaled aerosol for smoking has been something that people first started talking about when cigarettes became popular versus pipes, and they said, oh, pipes were healthier because of just the temperature of the smoke. But really, I mean, it's still tobacco smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the components of that smoke that are going to cause damage, and so it is possible that a bong, that the water, it's possible that it might reduce certain degradation products. It's probably not going to augment it. That's all I could say, chemically speaking. It is something that we actually want to study, but it's still mainly going to be almost the same as smoking a joint. It's probably going to be very similar. So if you want to smoke with a bong and an ice in it, go ahead. And it might be cool. The smoke probably does feel cooler on your lips, but it doesn't change the temperature of what you're going to inhale.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, by the time it gets to your larynx, it's body temperature for sure. That's what we know from Mary Sandage's. Yeah.
Arles needs a clarification on which strains have the negative effect on the digestive system.
Well, ones that would have more of a body effect, but it also depends on the individual and the amount that is consumed. So it's not that you have, a microdose that you have a GI problem, but that is a possible side effect of cannabis, is that of some strains that have some elements that would induce cramping in some people. So it's Jiries, do you know more specifically about different strains and whether or not they would have a GI?
No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. That might be hard to suss out. I think that probably THC content in general might, basically how high you're going to get, how much THC you're going to consume could really impact how your body responds to that. And especially, probably if it's like a stress-induced GI issue, then that could be a situation where you want to consume more CBD with the THC, so you get strains that have a little more equal of both, or an edible or whatever. And so that's probably that could be something I could theorize. But other than that, I think THC doses is going to be really important for that.
Yeah,
you might
exactly.
want to,
That's some really great questions coming in. Susanna Mizell says, can you address potential effects on mucosal production and quality? Is there a difference between edible and inhaled consumption?
Well, inhaled consumptions, both, you mean smoking or vaporizing because if you're vaporizing, then the humidity level would be a little different when you inhale it. And then you have the short and long-term effects on the nervous system, that if it had any impact on mucus production, I think is right. Is that what we're talking about? Mucus
Yes.
production. Yeah, and the mucosa, the effect on the mucosa. And certainly people do report some feeling of xerostomia, some dry mouth, when consuming cannabis. I don't think that the dry mouth is coming from the method, rather is more of a side effect of the THC or the elements that are being, you know, taken up by the body. I don't think it's that you smoke a joint and then you have dry mouth. I think it's if you consume a certain type of cannabis, you'll have potentially a side effect of xerostomia or dry mouth. Jairus, do you want to comment any further on that?
Yeah. I think that yeah, it's definitely just. I would assume that that effect is just a consequence of THC ingestion one way or another, and any measure that could be taken to just kind of level it out, because when we smoke or when you inhale by any method, it's really just a huge jump in THC blood concentration, and then it slowly goes down. And so that first half an hour or so, that's when you could have that side effect. With edibles, it's much more
Delayed and
it's a
prolonged.
much more gradual effect, so if it's a lesser dose, and if you have a full stomach, if you eat an edible on a full stomach versus not, it's going to be a much more gradual effect. And I just wanted to bring up this little interesting fact here. When you smoke or inhale, the time of onset is actually around like 15 to 20 minutes. And so when first inhaled cannabis, you might not feel immediately high, and so someone might take 2 or 3 or 4 puffs of a joint,
Right.
and say, oh, I'm not high. But then half an hour later, they may or may not regret that decision. And so it's definitely something to keep in mind.
I love that, Jerry. Keeping it real.
Yeah.
Well, and the problem is actually even worse with edibles, because it's even more delayed. So people consume more thinking, I'm not high yet, I'm not where I want to be, and then an hour later, yeah, they regret it, or maybe they don't.
Sandy calls it the whoa effect.
Yeah.
So Joelle in Caulfield says, have there been any studies done with the edibles and MTD? Do you think that the use of these would help relax an individual and allow for retraining of muscles better? Interesting question.
It's a great question, something to think about. Actually, it's a real good question, and actually what I've actually been thinking about and have actually approached a dispensary owner who's also involved in the state level here in the cannabis industry and the research that goes on with cannabis. We've been thinking about it for maybe vocal tremor or Parkinson's, to deal with tremor that comes up in Parkinson's, the hand, for instance. He tells me of patients who come to him, and he gets them specific strains with specific terpenes at a specific concentration that helps with their rolling pill hand tremor in people with Parkinson's. And so I said, well, do you think you could help somebody with vocal tremor, essential tremor? And so that's crossed my mind. So that's not a far out there question for somebody who lives in Portland, Oregon.
Absolutely.
But no, there aren't any studies. And the reason goes back, I don't know when this person joined us, but the reason really goes back to the fact that it's hard to study cannabis and any product that's cannabis derived, other than maybe hemp, which has no psychoactive elements, and so that's why it's used in industry.
Sorry.
And so, but what I would say is, I don't think we would need to treat. Well, I guess it would depend on the type of muscle tension you're dealing with. Is it localized to the larynx? Is it whole body? Because if somebody's wound up everywhere and is experiencing muscle tension everywhere in addition to their larynx, then maybe an edible would be a better way to go. But if we're talking about somebody with a sort of a mild or even just a localized MTD, then it's not going to help the intrinsic laryngeal musculature's physiologic configuration. But what it directly, what it might do is where there's any soreness, and when we're talking about muscle tension dysphonia, the soreness we're feeling is not the true vocal folds. There are no pain receptors. We have pressure receptors. Obviously, we need to know about airflow and air pressure, but there's no pain receptors. What we feel when we're feeling pain is muscular pain, the extrinsic laryngeal musculature that we're using, maybe the pharyngeal constrictors that we're employing to help us voice when we're not voicing efficiently. So maybe topical would be a better way, or like a bath. If they have a full body tension pattern that's getting in the way, maybe it's affecting their abdominal breathing, maybe they have back pain. I see a lot of patients who have back pain, and that affects their breathing. They try to breathe less because every time they take a deeper breath, they feel pain. And so they may be using sort of like a bath because they have more broad pain and discomfort. So not a bad idea, great idea. Let's all pass legalization of cannabis so that we can study it and see if there are any benefits for a CBD-based product that could help to decrease discomfort in this area. And at the very least, people with muscle tension dysphonia, they're very focused on their throat, which increases anxiety and creates more stress and more muscle tension. So if we can bring the focus away from this by creating more comfort, and they're focused on somewhere else, then, could there be a benefit? Maybe, but yeah, it hasn't been studied.
Lisa Grace, thank you for your patience. She asked that very early on about topical deep tissue CBD gels for the throat fatigue. So Erin, have you specifically with somebody with pain from MTD, or have you recommended that to them and had them give you feedback anecdotally?
Here's my my disclosure, professional disclosure, non-financial. I don't do a whole lot of laryngeal massage. I just don't, I just get results a different way. That's the beautiful thing about our voice, is that we have a lot of degrees of freedom. And so you can get the same sound and get the person there a lot of different ways. And so I don't incorporate a lot of massage.
But what about just the cream? I mean, what about just?
Yeah, and so I don't really talk about massaging that, because generally after a first session, I get people coming back saying my throat feels better because I'm using different voicing patterns. And I almost see that as almost a band-aid. I worry it's almost like having a sort of a lidocaine spray to deaden the pain in your throat when you are feeling sick, but you have to overcome it to sing. And then, are you singing too differently than you would normally because you can't feel the pain and maybe increased the muscle tension and are doing things less efficiently? And I wonder, okay, so here's the negative of using a solve, that you've now decreased the body's feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
There's pain here, do something different.
Mm-hmm.
Don't mask it. That said, I guess if you're in a lot of pain and you need some some relief, then you need relief. But I also wonder, let's not mask something and let's deal with the inefficiencies that are causing the pain.
And do you see higher, well, people that are smoking? So I have clients, of course, I work on the medical team, and I have a couple singers who have not told me, but my SLPs have informed me that they are using cannabis and they're dealing with, a granuloma, or where do you fall? I really like what you were saying about, you're not going to get this person that you were talking about in Ghana to change, but I'm in more control with students.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think I have a leg to stand on, I guess is what I'm saying, by saying this probably is contributing, or do we not have enough information to say that?
Okay, another disclosure. I'm a very, I love motivational interviewing techniques. I love counseling. It's a big part of my practice. And what I've learned about changing somebody's voice is that they have to make that decision. So what I offer you is that you offer them education and options. It's almost like the parent who, you know, is being, very demanding about what a child's allowed to do or not do. And the more they press that they can't do something, the more the kid wants to do it. And I think if you, and I'm speaking from experience, from my own being raised, the more my parents said something, the more I fought it, right? And so I think just say the facts, right? You want a career at the Metropolitan Opera. Well, let me tell you what that takes. It takes pristine vocal folds. Now, do you want a different career path? Because that's okay. That maybe doesn't require pristine vocal folds. But if your goal is to get to the Metropolitan Opera, or to win a Tony, or to have exquisite ability, and have very, very vast ability, which is what you need for a certain rep that's going to be performed at the Metropolitan Opera or in other venues of that caliber, your vocal folds need to be very happy, and the tissue needs to be very healthy, including the lung tissue, right? And so I would say educate, but also, yeah, I think I'm realistic in things when I deal with anybody. When I tell people don't do this, don't do that, they look at me and they don't do anything.
Right.
And so what I ask is, what will you do? Let me support you. Let me help you in doing whatever you want to do, the least harmful way, so that you can also achieve your goals. And here's what I know, which is not much, unfortunately, right? It's a lot of wisdom, just kind of a hunch based on what we know about some studies from the respiratory tract, and then some basic science tissue-based studies, and then some animal studies. So we don't have a lot of evidence to go off of. But yeah, I think obviously if you're looking for a very high caliber career in a really technically demanding genre, you got to be sensible about what your goals are and then what you're doing with your body. And so it's not just about vaping or smoking cannabis. It's about eating healthy. It's about avoiding getting influenza or other things that can affect your respiratory tract. It's about exercising so your respiratory system's healthy. So anybody who's going to be really thinking about that type of career, they're hopefully going to be already thinking about this in all aspects of their life. And then if they're not, and if that's not their goal to get to the Met, then I also think then we have a conversation about, well, what do you want? And here's how things are going to impact your vocal folds. And so I don't know if that's going to help you get to your goals. But we don't have a lot to go off of. And so also there's that problem with buy-in then. The student's going to say, well, you don't really know. And we don't.
Hopefully more is coming. As we finish up here at the top of the hour, is there anything else that you would like to share with teachers of singing and singers? Anything we missed that's kind of an important note about cannabis and singers?
Yeah, I think the main thing kind of gets back to what you said about the SLP telling you about the student. If you want to be able to guide the student, as we just talked about, and educate the student and provide them with options, then they have to feel comfortable to disclose that to you. And so I guess my piece of advice would be, if you want to be able to educate your students and have buy-in, then maybe consider the climate in which the discussion's happening, and allow the student to disclose safely, so they don't feel like there's going to be judgment. You can have judgment, just keep it to yourself. I think if you want a student to be forthcoming, you have to create the environment for that to happen. And then I think then you can educate, and I think people who are going to seek a career in a classical realm, and then anybody who's going to have a really serious career in music, where it's going to be their primary source of income, I think whether it be a singer or a singing teacher, I think they would be open to education.
I love that. Well, thank you both so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. Jiries, we really appreciate you joining us, and I look forward to more research. And let me just remind our NATS chatters that the April 19th is our next one, and it will be Joanne Bozeman and Kate Fraser-Neely, and we'll be talking about singing through change, serving women through midlife, menopause, and beyond. So I look forward to seeing everyone then. And in the meantime, as we're on the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg with the coronavirus, wash your hands and stay healthy as we move through this kind of national worldwide crisis going forward. So thank you. We're getting lots of thank yous from the attendees tonight.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Thank
much.
you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.